ARE Podcast, Season 1, Episode 2.
Welcome to the ARE Podcast. ARE Podcast, where it's all about encouraging and inspiring you today so you can fulfill your dream of becoming a licensed architect tomorrow. And now your host, David Doucette.
Hello. Welcome to another episode of the ARE Podcast. A very special show today. We have the Director of Examination, Jared Zurn of NCARB, is going to join us. So really excited about this show. Lots of good conversation. And Jared went through the ARE process as well. He is a licensed architect. He's a member of AIA. It took him 2.5 years, so he gets the starts and stalls. Took me 7 years, and Eric was something crazy like 4 months. When we had this interview set up, I actually was under the weather, so I wasn't able to participate. So Eric flew solo on this one. So Eric had the big job of doing the interview and riding the helm, and of course he did a fantastic job. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Eric, who's going to introduce Jared for this really amazing podcast. And a big shout out to Jared for coming on the air, discussing all of 5.0 with us, ARE with us, hopefully empowering candidates. All right, let's jump into the interview.
Okay, everybody, we're here with Jared Zurn from NCARB. He's Director of Examination. So if you need to be examined, I guess he's your man. And we were lucky enough to get an inside view of the new ARE 5.0 last year before it was unveiled, and to put Jared and his staff through its paces. So we're here today to talk to him about the new ARE 5.0, what he's learned since then, because that was almost a year ago, and really to get you excited about 5.0 as well, because I certainly am. So welcome, Jared.
Thank you very much.
So it's been a year since we last got to hang out. 5.0 is launched officially. We have candidates, of course, asking us a million questions about it. What have you learned since launch about 5.0?
Sure. Well, we've learned quite a few things. Whenever you go into something like this, you always have your plan in place. And then actually the first thing we learned is that candidates stayed away from 5.0 more than we thought they would. We had talked so much about the strategic testing and we knew we were tracking the data. So we knew there were thousands of people that had taken CDS, PPP, and SPD in 4.0. So they were totally ready to transition to 5.0. But then when we launched in November, they just didn't show up at the test center. So we started reaching out to them and asking the question why. We actually did some surveys out to our candidate population and said, hey, how come you haven't, shown up and tested? And what we found out is there was still just this, a level of uneasiness because 5.0 is new, it's different. And so NCARB had to figure out ways to help, additionally incentivize people to get in there and basically try 5.0 out.
Yeah, we saw that with, you had gift cards, you had retakes if they failed.
Right.
At one point, I think you were raffling a car. No, I'm just kidding.
We did not. I will say, honestly, that we talked about all kinds of different ideas. And one of the ideas that I will admit I threw on the table was maybe we should just give away a car. Like if you're an early tester, we'll draw everybody who's an early tester, their name goes in and we'll draw for a car. Well, no, that wasn't the winning idea. The winning idea was the free retest if you fail. And that has worked fantastically. I think that really allowed candidates to know going in that, okay, I'm still going to study, and we know the candidates are still preparing for the exam. But if they're unfortunate enough to fail, at least it takes away the sting, and they're going to be able to reschedule for free.
One of the things that we saw, and we've really been promoting people to do, is what we call do 7 for the price of 5.
Sure.
Right? Do three exams under 4.0, and then you only have to do 2 under 5.0. To me, it's the best of both worlds. You get to dip your foot in the 5.0 pool, and you get through a lot quicker.
Right.
How has been the reception on that? If it was me, that would have been the path I would have taken.
A lot of people have done that. And actually what we're hearing from candidates is there's still a lot that are planning to do that. So, we're still delivering ARE 4.0 until June 30th of 2018. So there are people that they're just starting to test in 4.0 because they want to take the 3 in 4.0, and then they're going to transition to 5.0 sometime probably in the spring, let's say, and then they'll finish out that way.
And one of the rumors that we heard from candidates, and I figure I'll go right to the horse's mouth here, is that when NCARB announced, okay, free retakes for anybody who took the 5.0 and failed, does that mean that the pass rates were really low? Does it mean the pass rates were too high? I know you have a science to all of this that we don't get to see on our end. What does it mean?
So, and we heard the same rumor. So the first rumor was actually that, the pass rates must be really high because that's why NCARB's willing to give away free tests, right? Because we wouldn't be willing to give away a free test if we were going to give away a lot of them. Well, the reality is we offered to give away the free test well before we even knew what the pass rates were going to be because we hadn't gone through the full cut score process. What I can say is we did release project planning and design. Score reports came out just yesterday. And now what we will tell you is that the pass rates for 5.0 PPD are kind of right in line with historic pass rates. Sort of what we expected would happen. You never anticipate a major jump in pass rates when you're redoing a licensure exam, and you would never expect a major decrease in pass rates when you're doing a major licensure exam. Okay. But what we're not doing is we're not going to publicly put out the pass rates for a few months because we're still working with a low volume of candidates, like just enough to get through the cut score. And we know that the pass rate's going to fluctuate a little bit over the next few months. So we're planning on releasing full-on pass rates for all of the divisions around the July timeframe. Give us a good 6 months of solid delivery with live reporting and all of that happening, and then put out the data.
When I was there last year and you were taking us through 5.0, a couple things really struck me. The first, and I've talked about this a lot actually to candidates, and it makes them feel better. So that's why I'm saying it again. The first one is that you and your staff, you're all architects. From what everybody I met was an architect.
Yeah, most of the examination staff are architects. We have 2 people on our staff that are not architects, but they're really on the operations side of the house, so they're more experts in candidate management and things like that.
And do you guys make fun of them all the time for not being?
No, they probably make fun of us, right? That's the way it should. That's the way it should be.
Are they the ones that are not wearing black?
I'm not wearing black. I have one. This is a green sweater. It's not a black sweater.
Okay, it looks a little dark. And then the other thing is that you and your staff were really, and I mean this in a nice way, very nerdy about the concept of testing. If you remember, we ended up getting into testing methodologies, and you used a lot of fancy German words that I'd never heard before. That were real. That were just. It was a great insight into this, and I walked away feeling more excited about 5.0 and better about it. And when I tell candidates this, they feel better about it. Can you tell us about the difference between 4.0 and 5.0 in terms of an overarching testing philosophy or methodology?
Sure. There's some big differences between 4.0 and 5.0. As most people know, 4.0 still has the vignettes included in them. And so the term we use for the scoring methodology in 4.0 is called conjunctive scoring, where you literally get a score on your multiple choice performance, and then you have this vignette performance over here on the other side. And what happens is that at the very end, those 2 performance points are combined to determine whether you pass or fail. So the good news is if you do better on the multiple choice, you can do slightly worse on the vignette and still pass. But if you do very poorly on the vignette, all of a sudden, regardless of how good you do on the multiple choice, you cannot pass the division. So what we know is that the vignettes, for some of the divisions, really do hold the pass rates down. Mm-hmm. That is the reality of 4.0 and the conjunctive scoring model. So we moved in 5.0 completely away from that model. We didn't want to do that anymore. What we wanted was every item to be of equal weight, and that's what's happening in 5.0. So even if you're answering a drag and drop item on a case study, that's worth 1 point. If you answered a single select multiple choice item at question number 3, just a standalone item, that's also worth 1 point. So from a strategy perspective, candidates should really approach 5.0 a lot differently than they approach 4.0.
Yeah, and you've made a real point, because I think I asked you 3 times in a row just to triple check. there's a couple changes. You don't call them questions anymore. They're called items.
Right. Well, yeah. So when I use the word item, it means a question.
Right. And it to me, it makes total sense given that there are now drag and place, hotspot, and multiple choice type questions, and then case studies that are directly tied to that. So items make sense. And then adamantly that you're not curving and you're not weighting any of the items, which is interesting to me.
Right, we are not. And that's what's so important, because we are hearing from candidates that case study items do tend to take a little bit longer, especially the first couple, as candidates are getting used to the resources. That's expected. We did some timing studies well before we launched, and we saw this exact same behavior. So we built into the allotted test time basically a block of time to just sort of digest the resources for the case studies. But it's good for everybody to understand that if you're getting into what is a complex item and it starts to take a long amount of time, if you still have 20 items to go, like, just mark it. Like, there's a little flag it, down on the bottom of the test driver, flag that item and then move on, come back to it later when you have more time.
Right. The score reports came out just this week, and so we've been hearing from our candidate, from our customers who bought our materials, they passed or they didn't pass, and they were
right.
The ones that didn't pass are upset, of course. But one universal thing that they've all said is that the time each item takes a lot longer, and so we've been preparing them for that. We've been telling them that, and we've even refined it a bit, where we've told them to give more time to the case study items, to really think about those as maybe 4 or 5 minutes each, and then the other items we just do the math. So PPD is 95 items total, I believe. And so we've kind of worked out a rough guideline. And what we found is that when we tell them this stuff, they really go into the test with that mindset. They really do. They read everything that NCARB puts out, everything that you put out, and they read everything that we tell them about in our study guides as well. So it's just been fascinating to see that. But they've also been saying that they've been using the full appointment time. Have you found that as well?
Yes, we have found that we do expect candidates to use more of the testing window than they used to. The reality is in 4.0, candidates to some degree were overpaying, because this was a big deal for NCARB. And I know, again, this is where I nerd out on testing and providing a good service. But the reality is I don't want a candidate to pay for 5 hours of seat time, but then really only use 4, because that means you've paid too much money. Right? That's like you going in and buying an extra large soda. You only drink 3/4 of it and then don't drink the rest. Well, that's kind of a waste. It's the same thing with testing time. So we really did try to make the testing window an appropriate length of time. Now, I know this has been a learning moment for our candidates, that those of them that tested in 4.0 were used to having a lot of time left over. And so now what they're realizing is, oh my gosh, I'm finishing and I really only have 5 minutes left. And that's not a bad thing. Like you finished, right? So that's good. And the reality is, you're done, but you also didn't pay us, and then in essence, us pay Prometric, an extra $20 for that seat time if you wanted to be there another, 20 or 30 minutes, because that's the reality of the business of testing.
It makes total sense, but from their perspective, what happens is they go on the forums. And then they email us and go, oh my God, I failed. Because when I did 4.0, I had hours to spare.
Oh, absolutely. That is true.
And now I don't.
A lot of times, people walked out of 4.0 literally with hours to spare on the seat time.
And it's every little thing. This is what we've learned about the candidates is it really affects their confidence, and their confidence affects their performance in the exam, we found. And so we're testing them as much as, or we're educating them as much on content as we are on coaching them on confidence and going in there with the right mindset, we found. And we have plans to do even more of it throughout the semester or throughout the year. How have you found that attitude affects their score outcome?
So it does. I think for some candidates it absolutely does, and for other candidates it really doesn't. I will admit, as you said, I'm an architect. I've been through this examination process too. I didn't walk out of any of my ARE exams when I took them feeling like totally confident, right? But I would wait for my score report, and then it would say, if it said pass on it, I was like, okay, I guess I did better than I thought. And if it said fail, I'm like, okay, I guess I did like I felt, right? Like that is the reality. I do know there is some psychology though around testing. Like anybody who goes in and psychs themselves out, that's a bad mindset to be in. So the fact that you're coaching people on like just staying positive when you're in the test center and how to prepare to move from item to item, and use, just like use that time wisely, that's such a smart strategy for taking a test, because if you psych yourself out, yes, it will impact your performance, even if you get to the end and you're just drained. These are still long exams. The exams are shorter, but I fully admit these are still long exams.
Yeah, the candidates have said, when I said, so how was it? There have been a lot of people that said, it was like being at work all day, but not getting paid for it.
Oh, that's a rough comment.
But I think that's what you're going for. In hindsight's always 20/20. And so the idea of going from topic-based divisions, site planning, for example, to phase-based that mirror the realities of the practice, is like, oh crap, that probably would have been good 20 years ago.
Right.
But who knew? But also what I found is that it really can test on the knowledge. So what we did, for instance, in our new study guides, because I learned this from visiting with you, is we have a lot of, in PPD, we talk about mechanical systems. But in PDD, we talk about mechanical systems as well, because we have to.
Absolutely.
But it's the context of the phase. You had said something that really stuck with us, which was, you said, imagine it as the scale. So in PA, programming analysis, you might be at 16th inch scale. In PPD, you might be at 1/8 inch scale. And in PDD, you'd be at 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch scale.
Right.
And does that still hold true? Are you still finding that analogy works?
It does. That analogy absolutely works, because it's about drilling down into the project as you move through that progression of an architectural project. And we've all been there. And eventually when you're in project development and documentation, you're at the point of that, maybe even 1.5 inch scale detail where you really know how flashing works inside of an assembly. And, guess what? The next question has to deal with specifications of, what type of flashing is the appropriate flashing to use in this situation. So it all comes together.
That's great. The one of the things that we tease candidates about is, and I guess a lot of people tease this generation. The bulk of the candidates are millennials by definition. And what we found from the millennials is this, in certain sense, they buck the whole stereotype of millennial, but in another sense, they don't, in that they have a slight, I don't want to insult anybody, but they have a slight touch of entitlement with the test. In 4.0 was a known quantity. We knew the vignettes. We knew what the experience would be going in, because they've been around forever. The vignettes that you deliver in 4.0 now are the same ones I took 20 years ago, basically.
Right, they are.
They are, right? So
it didn't change much. No, they have not changed much in 20 some years.
So there were known quantity. We knew the tolerances. With 5.0, we don't know those. There are no vignettes now, but also we don't know those tolerances as well. And what we found is that in 4.0, we were really prepping them to be good at test taking. Mm-hmm. We really trained them to be good at taking the vignette, but not necessarily applying the information. Under 5.0, I do believe it's a much better application of knowledge. But that's what they're complaining to us about. Are you finding that as well?
Yeah, and I don't think it's complaining. I wouldn't say that. I think it's trying to understand it. And I know I have the advantage of having seen 5.0 from its initial conception, just this idea, all the way through to what it is today. So I very confidently speak to what 5.0 is and the type of measurement we're making on the individual that's taking the test, and how that lends confidence to that state licensing board in granting that person a license to practice architecture. That's the real power of 5.0. Now, I get it from a candidate perspective that all of a sudden it feels like NCARB has, turned the corner and maybe didn't give them exactly the GPS coordinates on how to turn that corner. So we're still adapting ourselves. Like we're actively on our online community trying to find out, what the sense is on the exam. We're talking about what are some new resources we could possibly put out to help people understand it. I think test taking strategies is a huge one. I think mentoring people just through the process is a huge thing that NCARB hasn't engaged in the past, but it becomes really important to help people navigate what is 5.0, because 5.0 is a better reflection of the practice of architecture. And that's a big change. If you're a 4.0 candidate, 5.0 feels very different. It
is, but it's, I think rightfully so. It should be different. I've noticed you guys have been much more active on social media, on Facebook, responding. Mm-hmm. People been posting, and you've all been Johnny on the spot with responding to their questions. So there's been a palpable shift in that, which has been amazing. Is there, there was a big push to finish 5.0 and get it out. You said that you had rewritten every single question. There are, if my memory serves, there's 4 banks of questions for all 6 divisions now. Is that true?
So the way we have our item, we do have a massive item bank. What you're probably remembering is we have about 4,000 items.
Right.
In our item bank that are distributed across the 6 divisions. Not all 5.0 items are brand new. Some of them did port over from 4.0, but we reviewed all of those items to make sure they were still valid, because there were some 4.0 items that didn't make the cut and are not on 5.0 exams.
But is there, after that first initial push to get the product launched, so to speak, do you have a future wish list? Is the goal in the future to have a certain percentage of drag and place, hotspot, and multiple choice that you didn't do for launch but you're going to do later?
So we actually have those rules now. We have something on the back end. It's not something we shared with you because it's really the in the weeds side of it, but we do have something called we have forms assembly rules. So when a candidate goes in and tests, if let's say you test, you get form 1, I test, I get form 2, the rules make sure that we have about the same number. There's always a range, but we're going to have about the same number of drag and place items. So let's say I get 11, you may get 10, or somebody next to me may get 12, let's say, depending on the size of the form. Because what we also know is different item types do have a tendency to take longer than others.
Right.
So by balancing the item type, we can also help balance timing on the exam. I wouldn't want to give you an exam that has a whole bunch of, quantitative fill in the blank where you're doing a bunch of calculations and then some hotspots and then a whole bunch of drag and place, and then the next person gets a bunch of single select multiple choice. Well, that wouldn't be fair. So we do have form assembly rules to balance it out and we aggressively wrote new items to fill these new item types because we had multiple choice items. So we didn't have to write any of those, or very few of those, because we had a lot that came over from 4.0. But we have written a lot of hotspot, drag and place, and things like that. And case studies was a really big deal for us.
Yeah, and it's funny because I'm licensed in 4 states, but one of them is California. In California, in the old days, we used to have an oral exam. Now it's called a supplemental exam. But in the old, even today, it's still very case study oriented. So I almost feel like candidates in California have an advantage going through NCARB and going through a case study testing experience. It's prepping them for the California supplemental in a way, I feel like.
That's good. I haven't heard that before, but it's very true though. I mean, once you get used to this concept, you're going to do much better approaching it the next time. And I probably will find the same thing even with our 5.0 candidates, that after they experience 1 or 2 divisions of it, going into 3, 4, and 5, if they didn't do the strategic testing, those later divisions are going to feel more natural.
There's 2 very pronounced differences in 5.0 that really stood out to us as we were assembling our materials, and that is practice management and project management. Mm-hmm. Obviously, we did a mapping of our 4.0 content to 5.0 content, and so we knew what we needed to create. Practice management and project management, they're all new. They're all for us.
There's a lot of new stuff. There is a lot of new stuff. Yeah, and I will tell you that I get that question all the time. Like, why is there a division just on managing a firm, right? People want to know that question. And that actually came from our state licensing boards. So we received the feedback from the licensing boards that grant that individual license all across the country. And they said their number one issue that they deal with from a disciplinary action, it's more about practice management than it actually is the design elements. So that was one of the driving forces to pull practice management and then project management out into a separate division. Because again, I said earlier in this conversation, it's about the state licensing board having confidence in giving you that license. And that's what they asked us to do. They said, do a better job at sort of making sure people get what it means to run a firm.
Well, I remember in school, we had a class called professional practice, ProPrac.
So did I. Yep.
I think we all did. And at the time, everyone in my class thought of themselves as, Frank Lloyd Wright, the reincarnation, but when we got to ProPrac class, we were blown. First of all, I happen to have a great teacher. I still remember him. But we were all blown away by, oh my God, you're teaching us how to run a firm. But it was only one semester, and then it was never heard from again.
Right.
And so to see it come up in the ARE is amazing to me, because I do see that failure. It's the number one question I get from friends who are working in a firm and trying to figure out, how to rise within that firm, or if they should go off on their own. So that's a welcome addition in my mind.
Yeah, and one of the big changes we've made too at NCARB is we now aligned the AXP, the new experience program, to these same 6 practice areas. So what we're really hoping is that people are in a firm getting experience on how to run a firm and checking those tasks off in AXP, then coming into the exam and saying, well, yeah, I've actually done this. I've read more about it in preparing for the exam, so they're in a much better place overall. So
the idea, it seems from as an outsider, it seems like you're taking IDP and you're taking the exam, and they were really designed to go together much better.
Exactly.
By design.
Because they were not. Before it was like, here's ARE and here's 17 categories of IDP, and people really didn't see the connection. And now we've made that connection very clear.
Well, it's also now, I think it's starting to really have the rubber meet the road, because candidates are saying to us, how do I study for something like construction evaluation? I've never been on a job site.
Right. Okay.
And my first thought, and I don't say this to them, is, well, how did you finish IDP?
Right.
Are you just kind of making up numbers here? I mean, it's so. To me, I'm hoping that they use the exam as a way to go back to their bosses and say, I need to spend more time on a job site so I can not only complete IDP, but pass the AREs. That's
right.
The hope.
And again, so you have hit on exactly the goal of NCARB, right? Which is make sure somebody, is competent. And one way we can do that is get a structured amount of experience in certain areas, and then come in and demonstrate that you have the knowledge to apply, some of those tasks you've already demonstrated through the experience program. And, you take that, you combine it with your education, that's what sets you up to practice independently, which is a very important message for people to remember. That you said you're licensed in 4 states. That gives you the ability to independently design structures in 4 states in this country that the general public is going to walk in and out of on a regular basis. Like, that's a big deal.
When you say it, it sounds ominous, like dangerous.
Well, a little bit of it might be. It depends on how confident you are, right? But
exactly. I could terrorize people in 4 states.
In 4 states, that's right. And we don't want you to do that, right? We want you to design buildings that are safe for the public, and makes your client happy, right? Of course, everybody wants to make their client happy, but at the same time, it really is a public protection issue when you talk about architecture.
Right. I should say I didn't do 4 states at once. It came.
Absolutely over time.
It came about from me moving around a lot. When I moved, 3 years ago, I moved to Oregon. I was already licensed in 3 states at that point. I moved to Oregon, and I said, "Hey, I'm here. I want to be a licensed architect." And I had to take believe it or not, a very minor supplemental exam for Oregon, but it was nothing compared to California's. I was able to do it online.
Right.
How much does NCARB influence what the states administer? Because they each have their own architects boards. Mm-hmm. And how much are you in service to them, I guess, how does that relationship work with a state like California or Oregon or Minnesota?
Sure. So the reality is NCARB is a membership organization, and our members are the state licensing board. So we're the National Council of Architectural Registration Boards. So when somebody says, well, how many members of NCARB are there? The answer is there's only 54. It's the 54 states, Guam, Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and the District of Columbia. So they are the ones that influence us as an organization because they are the organization. And then what we're doing at the same time as staff, so one of the benefits I have as staff, benefits and responsibility is, okay, so I need to go learn best practices, and I need to bring that back and inform the state licensing boards on what are the best practices on examination development, because they don't have the time. These are licensed architects working in a firm and then volunteering their time with their state licensing board. So they look to us as NCARB staff to really provide them some subject matter expertise on the operational side, the development side of examination. And then the give and take is we actually look at them and say, hey, thanks, that's great. And we need subject matter expert architects to write items. Would you like to volunteer? And so many of our volunteers that write items for the exam or do our forms assembly committee, I don't write items. Like I said, we made a lot of case studies, and that was a whole bunch of volunteer architects helping NCARB create those items. And a lot of them come from our state licensing boards.
Yeah, I mean, it's a daunting task, to be sure. What about your wish list? You know, for years, NCARB has Vignette software for 4.0.
Mm-hmm.
One of the questions that I brought up a year ago was, would you have sample software for things like the hotspot or drag and place questions, or do you want to do that? Do you need to do it? What are your feelings on that?
So what we do is we do have our demonstration exam available online, so people can use that to play with the items and get a sense of how they work in the test center. I think as we look into the future, we are constantly going to be looking at ways to improve this exam. We already know, we launched knowing that this was version 1 of the 5.0 interface. So not talking about the content, but just talking about the interface. We know we want to make some changes to the interface. But part of it is we also wanted to get the exam out, right? Because you don't want to wait forever. You can't wait for a perfect exam. It's never going to happen. So we're going to make some changes to the interface. That's part of the plan. And then we are going to be looking at ways to refine these items. I will tell you, our item writers specifically love the case study concept. So I have heard, we are right now limiting, when you go in as a candidate and test, you're going to very likely experience 2 different case studies in each division. We have item writers that are telling us that that's all they want to write. Like they would love it if the candidate would show up at the test center and it was nothing but a series of case studies back to back to back to back. And we're like, hold up, like we're not going there right away. But those are the kind of conversations we do have in our examination committee about what are the ways we can make this exam do a better job of measuring a candidate's ability. Now, maybe if we do more case studies, we can even make the exam a little bit smaller. I don't know. I do know we're going to have to give them more time because, like we said, case studies take time, and that's a balance. So we have to figure out what's the right way to balance the candidate's time, the cost to the candidate, and the overall decision about competency.
The 5.0 test seemed to me, it almost seemed like the difference between working out your whole body, I'm going to go for a run and hopefully work out every muscle, versus having a trainer and a trainer saying, we're going to build this muscle here and test you on this muscle here.
Right.
And, it almost feels like you can be more strategic. Technically, could you, if each question is really testing their application of knowledge in a much more scientific way, in a much more directed way, could you technically cut the test in half in the future as each one gets more targeted? If we can refine our item types to get really good measurement, then yes, the items, we can start putting less items on the exam. But one of those terms you heard when you visited our office was it was a psychometrician. And these are the professional scientists that deal with, testing and all of that. So they're psychologists that also have advanced studies in the mathematics and measurement. And what they're going to tell you is the smaller the number of items you put on a test, the less reliable that decision really is. So it's always a balance between, if I ask you 5 questions about, material selection, is that enough to demonstrate competency about if they're all about brick? Do you really know brick? Well, if you can answer 5 questions and you get 4 of the 5 right, yeah, you probably really get brick. But the challenge is, if I only ask you 5 questions about materials, and that's related to concrete, masonry, steel, wood, all of a sudden you're going to go, yeah, no, 5 questions isn't enough. Like, you've got to ask more than 5 questions about materials. So that's that balance that we always try to find about
what's a good number of questions to get a good reliable answer without saying, hey, here, go take this 500 item test and we're going to really make sure you know every possible material out there.
Right. I'd be remiss if I let you go without talking about the rolling clock. And
okay.
I know this isn't totally your department, but
no, totally. Rolling clock is totally my department.
Is it? Okay, good.
Absolutely.
The candidates with us, like, you know, to you they're very polite. To us, they complain a lot about things, and so it's very common for us to hear words like the rolling clock bit me or got me again. You know.
Oh, okay.
Or you know, and David and I are thinking, no, it didn't. You waited too long. That's what we're thinking. Like, why don't you just finish in 5 years? Now, granted, I did back then. There were nine divisions, if you remember, and I did them 2 weeks apart. And I'm not bragging about that. I just wanted to get it over with. So there wasn't a rolling clock issue for me. Mm-hmm. And tell me about the rolling clock. Tell me about how you feel about it. I remember saying to you last year, candidates hate it, and and you said no, they don't.
So some candidates hate it. The reality is the majority of our candidates are never impacted by the rolling clock. Let's start there.
As it should be, you would think, right?
Right, as it absolutely should be. That the vast majority of our candidates are not impacted by the rolling clock. Now, the purpose of the rolling clock, again, it comes back to validity. So, and I know, again, this is the nerdy side of me, but we've actually done a study that has measured the rate of change across the 6 divisions of ARE 5.0. And so we use that study to then make a decision about what should the rolling clock be. So it's not an arbitrary decision. This 5 years was not something we just sort of plucked out of the air and said, oh, that's a nice round number. We didn't do that. It was, we brought in architects and they talked about what's changing in each one of, we call it a domain, what's changing in each one of those domains. And then not just that task force, we then went out to a larger survey population of architects to confirm the work of the task force. And what they really demonstrated and what the research tells us is that 5-year time frame because it ranged, of course, but then, of course, that would have been crazy. Like, they actually came back and said, you could have a different rolling clock for each division. And I said, that's a terrible idea because candidates would hate that. So we came up with a singular policy decision, that to stay with 5 years, because our data really showed that if you stay in architecture for 5 years and what you demonstrate related to practice management 5 years from now is no longer fully relevant to the practice of architecture. It does evolve that much. And I know a lot of people are going to say, well, it doesn't change that much. Well, it really does when you start looking at the way codes can get applied, new materials that are launched into our world all the time. There's new materials coming out. The whole materials transparency movement, which has really kicked off, is a big deal now. And that's an expectation that you should know that. You need to demonstrate competency. So I actually am a fan of the rolling clock for the reason that if you pass the division, like let's say you passed the division of the ARE back in, 2002. If you're going to come back now and say, well, I think that should still count, honestly, I have to look at you and go, well, that was a long time ago, and the world has evolved in architecture. So that's the purpose of the rolling clock. It's to make sure that, again, when that state board gives you a license, you're competent in current architectural practice. And then realize once you get licensed, then states after the fact require continuing ed. And I'm sure you're very good at doing your continuing ed. If you're keeping your license active in 4 states, you do a lot of continuing ed to maintain those licenses.
Yeah, I mean, luckily it's the ones that I'd use for California are the same ones I get to use for New Mexico, luckily. But I still have to track it all.
Right. And so really, again, this whole discussion about licensure comes back to demonstrate you're competent and demonstrate it within a window of time to ensure that you're still truly competent, because once you get your license, you're done testing. That's the reality of architecture. You get done with the ARE, you get your license, now you go into a continuing education mode, which is still extremely valuable. And that's another important issue. NCARB actually works on continuing ed with our state licensing boards.
Well, even anecdotally, from our perspective, the rolling clock kicks them in the butt to get them to finish. Whenever David and I are asked, gosh, should I take the exam now or should I wait a year? Our go-to answer is no, do it now. What are you waiting for?
Right.
Right. Stop looking for excuses. Just go, like we're like personal trainers. Like jump. And the role
and part of this is you never know what's going to happen. So right now you're going, oh, my life's kind of busy. And then you think, well, in a year, it'll calm down. And then of course what happens a year from now is you're like, wow, my life is even busier than it was a year ago. And so, I mean, I admit too, there's never a perfect time to commit time to take an exam. We've all had to just sort of, carve out our window. And I remember myself like sitting at my dining room table by myself, and my wife and kids are somewhere else. So I'm able to prepare to go take the ARE. And that is a reality, I think, for all of us. Like,
I took them. I was unmarried and no kids.
Well, there you go.
And I just studied. I had no life, and I just studied. Now I don't. I talked to a friend yesterday, and she just had her second child, and she's like, "What am I going to study? I had deadlines at work." So it's only going to get harder in my mind the longer they wait. Do you find a difference, and maybe you don't get to measure this, do you find a difference between the 27-year-old who fast-tracked, right, straight through architecture school, completed IDP quickly, and sat for the exam as early as possible, versus the 42-year-old never got around to getting licensed and now is trying to do it?
So we do. If you look at our NCARB by the numbers, which is a document that NCARB releases every summer, comes out around the June timeframe, there's various charts in there that talk to you about ARE performance based on time out of school, ARE performance, whether you did it as an early eligibility tester, which means even started testing before you were done with your AXP experience. And what it shows is that people who tend to test a little bit earlier, not like right out of school, get a little bit of experience, then they start testing, they tend to do better than people who wait a long time. You can it's a bit of a bell curve where performance goes up, and then after about that 5 or 6 year threshold, performance actually starts to go down for people. And it may be factors of, well, life's getting busier, they're just spending less time preparing. We don't, you never know exactly the causality of that, but there's definitely a dip when you go into the out years.
Well, the other, when I studied for the AREs, I used my notes from structures class, and I used my notes from HVAC mechanical class, because I still had the books, right? They helped me.
Right. And your textbooks were still relevant at that time.
Right. Now they're not.
Right.
But there was the distance out of school of the people that I haven't thought about structures in 10 years. Mm-hmm. And but it also adds to that confidence, and it intimidates them a bit. Do you think that under 5.0, because it mirrors the phases of practice, and the questions are more context based with case studies, do you think that 5.0 would be more enjoyable or easier? I hate that word, easier, but more palatable to someone who's an older candidate?
I think it's going to be. I think and maybe the right word is relatable. That when you go in, if you have experience in a firm and you sit down, I guarantee there are still going to be just solid knowledge questions on there. Do you know this? And so if you haven't experienced that in your firm because that's not the scope of practice, there's probably going to be some questions that feel like they're coming out of left field. But I bet a lot of the questions are going to be things you can relate to, because again, these questions are written by practicing architects. So if you're in an office and you're actively working, then it's going to make more sense. But again, if you're in a very limited window in your office and you only do healthcare and you only do really kind of the interior architecture side of healthcare, when you start seeing some of those site questions come at you, you're going to have to be ready for them. They're on the test. That may not be your day-to-day operation. So that's a good area to study in. I think that's what actually a tip I give a lot of people is, you shouldn't have to study for everything for this exam. You know some of this stuff already. You need to study for your weak areas.
The one of the things that you had said to me last year when we were out at your offices, and I'm paraphrasing, but I've been telling this story to candidates, and they've been saying, "Oh, that makes me feel better," is we've observed candidates overthink the questions.
Yep.
Right? They might get an item on the ARE about the owner-architect agreement. And in their mind, they'll think, oh, but one time I saw this anecdotal thing that happened, and therefore...
Yeah, don't do that.
Good. I was hoping you'd say that.
Yeah, don't do that. Like, right, go, okay, yep, owner-architect agreement. I know my roles and responsibilities. I know what the owner is responsible for, and I stick to those when I'm answering the question.
Yeah, you had phrased it beautifully, and like I said, I'm paraphrasing, but you had said, we don't know the candidates, we don't know their background, and we're testing them on the knowledge, so we have to we have to ask the question in a textbook way.
Right.
And so if we're asking you a question about the owner-architect agreement, we're looking for the textbook answer, not the way that people might have taught you incorrectly.
Right. And we're very transparent about this. When we talk about the owner-architect agreement, we're talking about the AIA owner-architect agreement. Because what we know is there's all kinds of firms out there that don't use AIA documents. They use other documents. But when you're coming into this test, you do need to make yourself aware of the standard forms of agreement, which are through the AIA.
Right. Any final thoughts? We're running out of time, but any final thoughts or anything that you didn't get to address that, or that I should have asked you, maybe that I neglected to?
I think the biggest thing about 5.0 is we know we're all in a transitional state. Like, so 4.0 is out there, 5.0 is now out there. Candidates are figuring out 5.0. Some candidates are still testing in 4.0. I think the reality is, and I say this a lot when I talk to individuals, it is about you. It's about the individual who's taking the test. And so don't think there's a magic answer for everybody to do well on this test. It really comes down to what experiences have you had? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? And then how are you going to commit to getting it done? And it really is a commitment to getting it done, whether that's you did it every 2 weeks. I did not fully. I fully admit I was a 2.5-year tester. I took some divisions and I take a break, and then I take another, like take a couple of divisions and I took a break, and then I failed some, and then I took some divisions. Like, that was my thing. But it was still an overall commitment to getting done. And the best part is once you're done, you're done. Like, that is a huge weight off everybody's shoulder. Like, I know a lot of candidates, it's never fun to be in the exam, but boy, when you get that last passing score report, that is a very good day.
Oh, I tell people to have a party. Have a big party, invite all your friends, go nuts, and celebrate it. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you, Jared Zurn, Director of Examination from NCARB. This has been great. You answered a lot of questions that I've been hearing from candidates and that even I had. Keep up the great work. Thank you. Thank you for everything you do.
Yeah. Well, Eric, thank you for having me. I mean, I think part of our goal, as you said, we're really trying to get out there and talk to candidates and message. So, you helping, spread the word is fantastic. So.
No, it's our pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the ARE podcast. Be sure to visit architectexamprep.com and check out our other podcast episodes, video tips, and the ARE blog. Remember to plan